Karen yells at flight attendant for not helping her lift her bag, says it's a man's job. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The atmosphere inside the aircraft was a mix of mild chaos and anticipation. Passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, trying to find their seats while navigating the cramped space. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, directing people to their seats and offering assistance with the overhead bins, trying to get the cabin settled before takeoff. The noise of chatter and the occasional squeak of the flight attendants' shoes echoed through the airplane as passengers, tired from the day's travel, prepared to buckle in for their journey. The plane, a large commercial jet, was nearly full, with only a few seats left unoccupied. Everyone seemed eager to be settled, to get comfortable, and to start their flight. Amid the shuffle, Karen approached the row where her seat was located, her oversized carry-on bag dragging behind her. She maneuvered down the aisle with a sense of urgency, clearly more concerned with the bag than with finding her seat. As she reached her row, she stopped short, glancing at the overhead bin. Her eyes narrowed as she sized up the space, calculating whether her bag would fit. It was large, too large for the standard overhead compartment, but that never stopped her before. With a quick glance toward the flight attendant, a man in his mid-30s, she snapped, "Excuse me. Can you help me lift my bag into the overhead bin? It's too heavy for me to handle." The flight attendant, who had just finished assisting another passenger, turned toward her. His face, though polite and professional, betrayed a hint of surprise. He was used to helping passengers with their bags, but something about the way Karen had phrased her request set the tone for what was about to unfold. He stepped toward her, taking a moment to assess the situation. "I can certainly assist you, ma'am," he said calmly, "but due to safety regulations, I'm not allowed to lift heavy items into the overhead bin for passengers. If you'd like, I can help you position it to make it easier for you to lift yourself." Karen's face immediately hardened at his words. It wasn't that she didn't understand the safety regulations, she just didn't care. In her mind, a flight attendant, particularly a man, should be there to serve and assist, to do the heavy lifting if necessary. The notion that she would have to struggle with her bag was not just inconvenient, it was beneath her. After all, it wasn't her job to worry about lifting oversized luggage, that was what she had expected the flight attendant to do. She let out an exasperated sigh, throwing her hands up in the air. "I'm sorry, but are you seriously telling me that you can't help me with my bag?" she snapped, her tone suddenly condescending, her words dripping with disdain. "You're a flight attendant. Isn't it your job to help passengers? I've had flight attendants help me with my bags before, and I didn't have to do it myself. Why is this any different?" The flight attendant remained calm, keeping his composure despite the increasingly hostile tone. He had dealt with difficult passengers before, but Karen's attitude was something new. Still, he knew that it was important not to escalate the situation further. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and polite, "I understand that it can be difficult to lift heavy bags, but it's not just about what I can do, it's about safety. The weight of your bag exceeds what I can safely handle on my own. If you need help, I'm happy to guide you through how to position it so you can lift it yourself, or I can assist you in placing it in a different location, but I cannot lift it for you." Karen's eyes flashed with irritation. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, clearly frustrated. "I'm paying for a service here, and I expect to be treated properly. It's your job to help me, not give me some excuse." She turned to the other passengers around her, her voice growing louder. "This is exactly what's wrong with this generation. Men nowadays don't know how to be helpful. It's like they've forgotten what it means to be chivalrous." The flight attendant's jaw clenched slightly, but he took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain professional. He had heard similar complaints before, though rarely with such an overt sense of entitlement. Karen's words, laden with a sense of superiority, seemed to cut deeper than they should have. It was the implied expectation that, because he was a man, he should automatically perform the physical labor without question. "Ma'am," he began again, his voice slightly firmer but still composed, "chivalry isn't about lifting someone's bag into an overhead bin. It's about mutual respect and understanding. I'm here to help, But I also need to follow the guidelines that ensure safety for both you and for me. I'm sure you can understand that. But Karen, already convinced that her entitlement should be met with immediate compliance, wasn't listening. She didn't care about safety protocols, she cared about getting her way, and at that moment, she saw the flight attendant's refusal as a personal affront. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, glaring at him, her patience evaporating. "This is ridiculous," she repeated, her voice rising in volume. "You are being so lazy. I've never been treated like this before. You're just standing there, doing nothing, making excuses instead of doing your job. It's a man's job to help with things like this, and you're just sitting there, too lazy to do it. What kind of flight attendant are you?" The words hit the flight attendant like a slap in the face. He felt his face flush slightly, not from embarrassment but from a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He had spent his entire career working hard to provide excellent service to every passenger, regardless of their attitude, and yet here he was, being belittled for doing his job by following the rules. He had been patient, kind, and understanding, and yet Karen continued to attack him for something that, in his mind, wasn't his fault. The idea that his professional boundaries were being questioned because of his gender was something he wasn't prepared for. He wasn't angry, he was hurt, confused, and disheartened. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still steady but now laced with a hint of finality, "I'm sorry you feel that way, but I cannot lift your bag into the overhead bin. It's not a matter of being lazy or not being chivalrous. It's about following the rules, ensuring your safety, and ensuring that no one gets injured. I'll help you as much as I can, but I cannot do what you're asking." Karen's face turned red with frustration. She was now fully entrenched in her belief that she had been wronged, that her request was perfectly reasonable, and that the flight attendant was being obstinate for no reason. She looked around, hoping that someone would come to her defense, but no one did. The passengers around her were silent, not wanting to get involved in the confrontation. Her voice trembled with pent-up anger as she spoke again. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, before turning to the flight attendant and adding, "You're lucky I don't report you. You've been unhelpful and rude. You've made my entire experience miserable." She reached for her bag, attempting to lift it on her own, but struggled with the weight, still glaring at the flight attendant. Finally, after a few attempts, she managed to shove the bag into the overhead bin, though it was a tight fit. She slammed the compartment shut with a force that rattled the entire row, and with a final, seething look at the flight attendant, she took her seat. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, watching her, feeling the sting of the interaction, but he knew he couldn't dwell on it. He had done his best to remain professional, to help her within the boundaries of safety and protocol. He wasn't at fault, no matter what she had said. He turned away, moving on to assist the next passenger with a smile, despite the lingering bitterness from the encounter. As the plane began its taxi down the runway, the flight attendant continued with his duties, the incident already beginning to fade into the background of his mind. There would always be difficult passengers, but he knew that he had done his job with dignity, even when faced with unwarranted hostility. And as the plane took off into the skies, he took a deep breath, reminding himself that he had remained calm and professional throughout, despite everything. Karen sat in her seat, still fuming from the exchange she had just had with the flight attendant. The overhead bin above her was now closed, her oversized bag crammed into the compartment after her own efforts, though not without struggle. She could feel the tightness in her chest as her anger simmered beneath the surface. How dare he refuse to help her? How dare he stand there, explaining the rules as if she didn't already know them, instead of simply doing his job? She had been traveling for hours, and she had expected a certain level of service, especially from the airline she had chosen. After all, she was paying for this flight. She was a customer, and the expectation that she would have to do anything herself was an offense. In her mind, flight attendants were there to serve, to make things easier for passengers, and the idea that she would be left to struggle with her bag felt like an insult. As the plane took off and began to ascend into the sky, Karen's thoughts continued to circle back to the flight attendant. She couldn't understand why he had responded the way he had, why he had been so adamant that he wouldn't help her lift the bag. It wasn't as if she had asked for something unreasonable. It wasn't as if she had demanded that he do anything that wasn't part of his job. But in her view, he had been lazy, unhelpful, and downright rude. How dare he stand there and tell her that it was for safety reasons that he couldn't help her? To her, that was nothing more than an excuse, a poor attempt to avoid doing the work he was paid to do. She had seen other flight attendants help with bags before, both male and female, and they had never made such a fuss about it. No, he was just lazy, and she had every right to call him out on it. Karen let out a sharp sigh, rubbing her temples as the plane leveled off. She was still seething, but part of her knew that she needed to calm down. She didn't want to make a scene for the rest of the flight. There were other passengers around her, after all, and she didn't want to be the person who disrupted the peaceful atmosphere with her complaint. But that didn't stop her from feeling the indignation that had taken root deep inside her. The flight attendant's refusal to help had struck a nerve, and it was something she wouldn't soon forget. He had been dismissive, condescending even, when all she had wanted was a little help. She wanted to feel taken care of, to feel as though she mattered as a customer, and instead, she had been met with resistance. As the flight moved forward, Karen's thoughts drifted back to the moment when she had confronted the flight attendant. His face, calm and collected, had been so frustratingly impassive. It had been as if he hadn't even understood the severity of her frustration. And then, to top it all off, he had tried to explain it away with that safety excuse. Safety, she thought bitterly, was just a convenient excuse for laziness. She had been the one who had struggled to lift her bag, not him. He had stood there, hands at his sides, making no effort to help her. How was that not lazy? If he had been more proactive, if he had just offered a hand instead of standing there, it wouldn't have escalated the way it had. She was sure of it. But now it was too late. The damage was done. As the cabin crew began their in-flight duties, walking down the aisles with the drink cart, Karen glanced out the window, trying to calm herself, trying to will away the frustration that was threatening to consume her. She watched the clouds below, the vast sky stretching out before her, and for a moment, she let herself relax. The flight was smooth, the hum of the airplane engines a constant presence, and for a few minutes, she was able to block out the anger that had boiled up earlier. She knew she wouldn't let the incident define her entire trip, but it still lingered in the back of her mind, an unresolved irritation that wouldn't easily fade. But Karen was nothing if not determined. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, she found herself growing restless once more. She couldn't let it go. She needed to do something about it. She needed to make sure that flight attendant knew exactly how his behavior had affected her. She wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when she felt wronged. She had dealt with rude service before, and each time, she had made sure to address it. Whether it was a complaint letter, a phone call to customer service, or a public review, Karen always found a way to make her voice heard. This time, she would do the same. She would make sure the flight attendant knew that she expected better, that he had failed in his duty to provide the kind of service she deserved. After all, she was paying for it. Karen decided she would file a complaint. She would write to the airline and explain exactly what had happened. She would describe how the flight attendant had refused to help her, how he had made her feel invisible and unimportant, and how his behavior had ruined an otherwise pleasant experience. She knew that her complaint would get the attention of the airline, and they would surely take her side. She had dealt with customer service before, she knew how to push the right buttons, how to frame her complaints in a way that would get results. She wasn't about to let this one go unnoticed. Her fingers itched for her phone, and she pulled it from her bag, opening the airline's website. As she began typing, her anger flared once more, her words coming fast and sharp as she recounted the details of her encounter with the flight attendant. She could feel the heat rise in her chest as she typed, the words flowing out in a rush, each keystroke an attempt to vent the frustration that had been building all day. By the time she finished, the email felt like a release, a way to ensure that her voice would be heard, that her complaint would be taken seriously. She hit send and leaned back in her seat, feeling a sense of satisfaction as the message was transmitted into the digital ether. The rest of the flight passed without incident, but Karen remained unsettled. Despite the fact that she had made her complaint, a part of her knew that she wasn't likely to hear back from the airline anytime soon. And even if she did, what would they say? Would they apologize and offer her some kind of compensation, or would they simply brush her off as a disgruntled passenger? She couldn't say for sure, but one thing was certain: she had made her feelings known, and that was what mattered most. As the plane began its descent toward the airport, Karen glanced around at the other passengers, all of them seemingly oblivious to the tension that had simmered beneath the surface during the flight. She felt a pang of guilt for letting the situation get to her. After all, there were bigger problems in the world than a flight attendant not helping her with her bag. But despite that, she couldn't help herself. She felt as though she had been slighted, and in her mind, that was something that deserved attention. The plane touched down smoothly, and as it taxied to the gate, Karen stood up and gathered her belongings, ready to disembark. The flight attendant, who had been moving through the aisles assisting passengers, made his way toward her row, but she barely looked at him. Her mind was still on the complaint she had sent, still thinking about how to follow up if necessary. She walked off the plane with a sense of finality, her frustration somewhat eased, but not completely resolved. She knew she would never forget the incident, but she also knew that, in the grand scheme of things, it would eventually fade. For now, though, she had made her point, and that was enough to satisfy her. The flight attendants continued their duties as the passengers began to file out of the aircraft, each one seemingly eager to reach their final destination. Karen walked down the narrow aisle, her movements purposeful, her posture still rigid from the frustration that had built throughout the flight. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her as she passed, some of them offering her polite smiles or nods as they disembarked, unaware of the tension she had experienced just moments earlier. She, however, was far from unaware of the weight of her feelings. The incident with the flight attendant still simmered beneath the surface, gnawing at her, and though the flight had ended and she was free to leave the plane, the irritation remained like an itch she couldn't scratch. As she stepped onto the jet bridge and made her way into the terminal, Karen's mind was consumed with thoughts of the complaint she had filed. Her fingers had typed the email swiftly, each word an expression of the indignation that had taken hold of her during the flight. The flight attendant's refusal to help her, his insistence on hiding behind safety regulations, had been the final straw in what she had already considered a stressful travel day. She wasn't the type to back down when she felt she had been wronged, and in her mind, this was no different. She had made it clear in her email that his behavior had been unacceptable, that it wasn't just a matter of customer service, it was a matter of respect. And as far as she was concerned, the airline needed to know that anyone, needed to remind their staff about what it meant to treat customers with the care and attention they deserved. Her steps were quicker now, her focus entirely on reaching the baggage claim area. It wasn't that she wanted to linger on the incident any longer than she had to, but she couldn't shake the sense of dissatisfaction that clung to her. She had sent her complaint, sure, but what would happen next? Would the airline respond with an apology? Would they offer her compensation, a voucher, perhaps, to make up for the discomfort she had suffered? The thought of getting some sort of reward for her trouble made her feel momentarily vindicated, but the feeling was fleeting. She wanted more than just a response. She wanted the flight attendant to know how he had made her feel, to realize that his refusal to help wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a sign of a broader problem, one that reflected poorly not only on him but on the airline as a whole. As she waited for her bag to arrive on the conveyor belt, Karen glanced around the baggage claim area. The crowds were starting to thin, and she could see a few other passengers already retrieving their bags, some of them quietly chatting with one another, some of them rushing to their destinations. She stood there for a moment, lost in thought, wondering how she would go about ensuring that the flight attendant understood the impact of his actions. Her frustration had been palpable in her email, but would that be enough? Would the airline take it seriously, or would they dismiss her complaint as the grievance of a difficult customer? It seemed unlikely, but the nagging doubt crept in nonetheless. Maybe it wouldn't make a difference. Maybe she was overreacting. But then again, why should she apologize for expecting a reasonable level of service, especially when she had gone out of her way to express her dissatisfaction in a calm, measured manner? Her bag finally appeared, and as she grabbed it off the belt, she tried to push the negative thoughts from her mind. The incident was behind her, at least, that's what she told herself as she made her way toward the exit. But as she walked through the terminal, heading toward the car rental area, something began to shift within her. The anger, which had been quiet for a while, slowly began to bubble up again. She hadn't felt like this in years, so misunderstood, so unappreciated. She had been polite, she had made her request clearly, and yet the flight attendant had acted as though her request was beneath him. It wasn't about the bag itself, it was about his attitude, his refusal to take responsibility for what she saw as basic customer service. Had he been more helpful, had he treated her with the respect she deserved, perhaps the whole situation could have been avoided. But he hadn't, and now she was left with nothing but the frustration of a service experience gone wrong. It wasn't even that she needed a full apology, though that would have been nice. It was that she wanted to feel like she had been listened to, like her needs mattered. Karen couldn't help but replay the flight attendant's words in her head, "I can't help you because of safety regulations." The more she thought about it, the more the phrase felt hollow. What safety regulations? Wasn't his job to assist passengers? He had been standing there, perfectly capable of helping, but had chosen not to. And the excuse, safety regulations, seemed like a convenient way to avoid doing the work he was paid for. In her mind, it was simple: if someone asked for help, you helped them. The fact that he had refused to lift her bag made her feel small, as though her needs didn't matter, as though her request was somehow beneath him. That was what stung the most. It wasn't just the refusal, it was the attitude, the implication that she was asking for too much, that her comfort didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. By the time Karen reached the rental car area, she was ready to call the airline's customer service line. She wasn't just going to let this go. She couldn't. Her experience wasn't just about her bag, it was about the way she had been treated, the way the flight attendant had made her feel invisible. She pulled out her phone, ready to dial the number, but before she could hit send, she paused. What was she doing? Was this worth it? Was she really going to waste more of her time on this? It wasn't that she didn't feel justified in her complaint, it was that, deep down, she knew that making a fuss might not change anything. The flight was over, her bag was now in her possession, and there was a car waiting for her. Perhaps it was time to let it go. She stood there for a moment, the phone still in her hand, torn between the urge to push forward and the realization that perhaps some battles weren't worth fighting. Maybe the flight attendant had been rude, but was it worth spending more energy on? The sense of powerlessness, the feeling that she could make no difference no matter how loud she became, was overwhelming. She had sent the email, she had voiced her frustration, and now, perhaps, it was time to move on. After a long pause, Karen put the phone back in her bag and turned toward the rental counter. The decision felt like a small victory, a choice to let the situation go rather than drag it out further. Maybe the flight attendant would never know how much his actions had hurt her, and maybe she would never get the apology she was hoping for. But she realized, as she approached the counter to pick up her keys, that she had already taken back her power by deciding not to let this incident define her. She had fought the fight, and now it was time to walk away. With a deep breath, she smiled to herself, ready to move on to the next chapter of her trip. As Karen left the car rental counter, the weight of the day's frustration seemed to slowly begin to lift from her shoulders. The tension that had built up over the course of the flight, the encounter with the flight attendant, and the frustration of feeling wrong started to fade, even if only slightly. As she walked toward the exit, she couldn't help but replay the incident in her head one last time. The flight attendant's words, the polite yet firm refusal to help her lift her bag, the excuse about safety regulations, it all felt so unnecessary. She had come into the situation expecting basic customer service, a little help with her bag, but instead, she had been met with resistance. It wasn't even the physical act of lifting her bag that bothered her, it was the dismissal, the assumption that she was asking too much, the sense that her needs didn't matter. She had wanted, so badly, for the flight attendant to simply acknowledge her frustration, to admit that, yes, maybe the situation had been handled poorly, that he could have offered more assistance. But he hadn't. He had stuck to his rigid, impersonal response about rules and regulations, as though that was the end of the conversation. As though her discomfort didn't even warrant a second thought. The more she thought about it, the more it upset her. How could anyone, especially someone in a position of service, act so indifferent? How could he stand there, refusing to help her, when his whole job was to make the flight experience easier for passengers? But as she took a deep breath and reached the doors of the terminal, she realized that all this thinking, all this replaying of the scene over and over, wasn't helping her feel any better. If anything, it was only making her more upset, more entrenched in the belief that she had been wronged, that she had been denied the respect she deserved. She paused for a moment just outside the terminal doors, her thoughts swirling, and then made a choice. Maybe she wouldn't call the airline's customer service line after all. Maybe it wasn't worth it. Maybe she didn't need an apology or a compensation voucher to make her feel better. Karen knew she had every right to voice her dissatisfaction, and in fact, she had already taken that step when she sent the email. She had made her feelings known, and she had expressed herself clearly and firmly. But what good would it do to keep fighting the same battle, to keep revisiting the same frustration? The flight was over, the incident was behind her, and dragging it out further would only serve to extend her own frustration. She had vented her anger, made her complaint, and now it was time to walk away. Taking another deep breath, Karen shook her head, pushing the thought of the complaint out of her mind. She didn't need to carry this anger with her any longer. She had spent too much of her life feeling as though she had to constantly defend her needs and assert her rights. She had made a conscious decision to demand better treatment, but now, as she stood there, realizing how much emotional energy she had invested in the incident, she couldn't help but feel a little weary. This wasn't the kind of energy she wanted to bring with her into the next leg of her trip. She didn't want to let a single interaction dictate her mood for the rest of her time away. Karen had been through enough stress in her life, enough moments of conflict, enough emotional battles that drained her. This was just one of those moments that didn't need to be carried any further. She glanced up at the sky, noticing the clouds starting to part, letting a bit of sunlight filter through, warming the air around her. It was a sign, or so she told herself, a sign that maybe it was time to release the hold that this event had on her. She wasn't someone who usually let things go this easily, but in this moment, she realized how much lighter she felt when she did. With that realization, Karen walked toward the parking lot, her pace slower now, more deliberate, as if with each step, she was leaving the incident further behind. There was something cathartic in the act of walking away, and choosing to let go of the weight that had burdened her for the last few hours. She had made her voice heard, she had stood up for herself, and that was enough. She didn't need to prove anything more to anyone. As she drove toward her next destination, Karen allowed herself to relax. The tension that had held her so tightly during the flight was dissipating, replaced by a sense of calm that she hadn't expected. It wasn't that she had forgotten about the incident with the flight attendant, it was that she had accepted that she couldn't control everything, and sometimes, letting go was the best thing she could do for herself. She could hold on to her righteous indignation, her need for validation and apology, or she could choose to move on and embrace the rest of her trip with a more open, lighter heart. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but Karen was learning the power of choosing peace over conflict. The drive was smooth, and as the miles passed, Karen found herself drifting away from the earlier frustrations. She wasn't going to allow that one moment to overshadow the rest of her journey. It was just a small, insignificant part of her day, and though it had felt monumental in the moment, in hindsight, it was nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience, a blip on the radar of her travels. As she reached her destination, Karen parked her car and took a moment to appreciate the stillness of the evening around her. The world outside was calm, and for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of peace. As she stood outside the car, stretching her legs after the long journey, Karen realized that this was exactly what she needed. The incident had been a test of her ability to control her reactions, to decide how much emotional energy she was willing to invest in something that, in the grand scheme of things, didn't truly matter. She had chosen to let go, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her peace. The flight attendant's actions no longer had the power to affect her mood or ruin her trip. She was in control, and that was the most important thing. Karen smiled to herself, closing the door behind her as she walked into the building. The world was hers to enjoy now, free from the weight of the past. The rest of her journey was ahead of her, and she was ready to embrace it, with a lighter heart and a sense of renewal.